G'day YouTube, Warbles Odd here. With episode 17 in my partial book reading of Tim Bowden's biography of Neil Davis, combat cameraman, titled One Crowded Hour. And of course, one does not pretend to be sober, as we shall see. Episode 17, which is the middle part of chapter 16, The Man Who Liked Everybody. And to recap, we're talking November 1970, and Davis is going into Bangladesh, Pakistan. What do they call it? East Pakistan, looking at the results of floods. And it was pretty interesting. Davis and Barron were together again in November 1970, covering the aftermath of the cyclone and tidal waves that engulfed low-lying areas of East Pakistan before it became Bangladesh. The Pakistani government handled the disaster so ineptly that its callous incompetence was a major cause of the Bangladesh War of Independence. Letter to Aunt Lillian, 20 November 1970, Intercontinental Hotel, Dhaka. There is little I can say about the devastation here. It is just beyond description and leaves one numb. The reports are comparatively conservative. Tonight's local newspapers carry the death figures. Estimates, really. Because on dozens of smaller islands in the Bay of Bengal, there is nobody alive to give an accurate description of what happened there, or even how many people previously lived there. But as one leading newspaper said tonight, not a million, but millions are dead. Davis, one of the first into Dhaka for this story, managed to unveil himself onto the helicopter of Pakistan's president, Yahya Khan. His exclusive footage was bounced from satellite to screens around the world, but there were some amazing unrecorded scenes in the president's helicopter. As Davis crouched and filmed against the shaking interior of the helicopter, Yahya Khan was downing a mountain of cold beers and bellowing orders to his luckless staff as they circled the disaster zone. The president, Davis told Barron, hadn't looked out the window often. He was too busy opening cans and didn't bother to conceal his colonial-style contempt for the devastated Bengalis below. Correspondents who knew Davis in the early years of covering Indochina attest to his willingness to share information and give useful tips to his brother and sister correspondents, even if they were in direct competition. This was most unusual in a cutthroat business, with egos and deadlines usually fostering taut, terse relationships between rival media groups and individuals. Jim Bennett of the American ABC News Network thought that Davis had worked so long and hard in developing a keen sense of how to cover combat that he did not want to see such expertise go to waste. He was just as helpful to the adrenaline-fringed freelance freaks as to the heavyweight names of the major agencies and networks. Korean Josep Joe Lee was trained by Davis in the bizarre art of combat reporting, and Davis recommended him to Bennett for assignments in Cambodia. The three men became close except for one thing. Davis had a real aversion to letting others join him in the field. He did not want the responsibility for anyone else's life when the chance came to venture just a bit further than others might have dared. Documentary film producer Jim Gerand believes Neil Davis helped him to survive. Gerand says Davis took people as he found them and shared without asking anything in return. That information was priceless in Cambodia, where press casualties were higher than in Vietnam. The ferocity of the fighting and the lack of helicopter transport, coupled with the lackadaisical approach of Cambodian villagers giving guidance to an impatient pressman, could be a lethal mixture. Gerand was once directed to an enemy mortar position by Lon Nol troops who honestly believed it was theirs. In the early years of the Cambodian War, before the Khmer Rouge took over the main combat, the Lon Nol forces were actually fighting the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese. Davis told Gerand to beware of the VC habit of booby-trapping corpses, and the very next week he saw Cambodian troops killed by a grenade-primed body. Davis, Gerand believed, took great pleasure from his generosity and being able to earn the admiration of his peers and protégés. Davis confirmed this. I value friends and friendship above everything else. I never forget or forsake a friend. A good friend of mine, Jack Langguth, who worked for the New York Times but also wrote books of great depth and compassion on many subjects, once asked me my opinion about a certain politician in South Vietnam. Before I could answer, he laughed and said, "But it's no good asking you because you like everybody." I took that as a compliment, actually, because I do like everybody, or at least I try to see their better side. I'm also always optimistic, and even on the battlefield, when the situation looks hopeless, I will find kindred spirits everywhere. That's why I liked being with Cambodian troops. They laughed and joked in the face of adversity, and then came up with militarily ridiculous plans which, because they were so crazy, often took the other side unawares and led to a miraculous escape. Langguth also had reason to be grateful for Davis's fieldcraft. He had planned to enter Cambodia from Vietnam with the troops of one Vietnamese general. "Never," said Davis, "but go with General D. He'll get you in and out alive." He did. Fellow Australian Don Sims, who was in Saigon for the ABC when Davis first arrived, believed Davis saw himself as an Errol Flynn figure. Simmons, a loner himself, shared his apartment with Davis in Saigon for a month in 1965. While they went into the field covering combat, they passed like ships in the night, Simmons remembers. He did not feel he ever really understood or knew Davis. He believed Davis was afraid of people knowing him too well and did not encourage intimacy above a superficial level. There was a personal space around him which could not be breached. Davis's dress sense could at best be described as execrable, bracket, proper word for shitty, close bracket. He was partial to powder blue shirts with white piping around the collars and pockets, alternating with repulsively garish tropical shirts of the sort worn only by American 10-pin bowling teams on tour or by Cuban hoods in Miami. A penchant for brown suede boots stayed with him all his life, and in later years he affected bright red socks to bridge the gap between suede boots and trousers in varying pastel shades. Gary Burns of Viz News swore Davis must have been colourblind. There might have been an element of inverse snobbery too. Taken to an exclusive London club once by the managing director of Viz News, he turned up in a sports coat, skivvy and brown desert boots. But on the field of battle, Davis gave away the Hawaiian shirts and red socks to blend in with his surroundings. Da-da-da-da-da-da! Neil Davis blending in with his surroundings, wearing jungle green army fatigues and combat boots while carrying his 16mm spring-wound, clockwork-driven Bell and Howell camera. Da-da-da-da-da-da! Charge! In South Vietnam, it was army fatigues because the military was generally well outfitted. When I went with the Viet Cong a couple of times, I wore a black shirt, as they did, like most of their cadre and guerrilla soldiers. In Cambodia, I wore a mix of military and civilian clothes because few Cambodian soldiers had a complete uniform. I dressed for my surroundings, with a green floppy bush hat favoured by the Australian troops to cover my blonde hair, which made an inviting target. My motto was, blend in with your surroundings and you'll live longer. But his pathological inability to resist a wager often shortened those odds. On one occasion, he went up to Da Nang in the north of South Vietnam to film a story on the Australian Army training team. Uncle Mac's mob. These men were all warrant officers and most were also trained as paratroopers. They received extra pay for this, but had to do a certain number of jumps per year to maintain their rating. During a solid night's drinking, some of the warrant officers bemoaned the fact that they would have to be up at 5 the next morning for a parachute jump. Davis unwisely said, "Fancy getting money for that. Anyone can fall out of an aeroplane." Famous last words. One thing led to another, and he accepted a bet to jump with them. At 5 a.m. he was hungover and scared witless, but he went through with it, not only for his own honour, but the reputation of journalists generally. All the country around Da Nang was crawling with communist troops, and I'd never parachuted in my life. They strapped a parachute on me and gave very rudimentary instructions of what to pull when I got clear of the plane and pushed me out. I thought I'd broken a leg when I hit the ground. Getting on an aircraft at Saigon's Tan Son Nhut Airport on 1 November 1968 proved equally hazardous. Davis was to fly to Phnom Penh to meet Tony Ferguson for an assignment. Taken in for questioning by the Vietnamese police at the airport, he was interrogated about currency violations and black market operations. Davis was carrying a wad of undeclared US dollars at the time and operated on the black market, as did most in those days. In fact, he had an Indian money changer called Dima conveniently operating from a broom cupboard-sized room in the Viz News Saigon office. He was taken to a room where two American civilians appeared and began questioning him at length about the origins of his currency deals. The plane left without him, and the questioning became not only insistent but accompanied by violence. Unwisely, he got a bit cheeky with them and said, all right, I'll tell you where I'm buying it." The two Americans huddled closer to him and said, "Yes, yes," expectantly. Davis lowered his voice and muttered, "From Robert W. Comer." Comer was the senior American official enthusiastically in charge of the pacification program WAMO, winning the hearts and minds of the people. At this, the Americans really wailed into him with fists and boots, and things were not looking at all good. They left him alone for a while, and Davis later told Tony Ferguson in Phnom Penh that he had not been at all sure how he would get out of it. He was left in the care of the Vietnamese security officers, one of whom, it turned out, had a brother in an ARVN unit. Davis had just filmed in the Mekong Delta region, south of Saigon. Davis was able to tell the security guard that his brother was happy and well and doing a magnificent job for his country. The guard conferred outside the room with two Americans, and shortly afterward, Davis was allowed to return to his hotel with instructions not to try to leave the country. He told an influential American journalist what had happened, and the journalist demanded a meeting with the American ambassador, Ellsworth Bunker. The American's simple message was that if such crude assaults on journalists did not stop immediately, he and other pressmen would publish a list of all the American officials whom they knew were dealing in the black market. Bunker ordered an investigation, and it was discovered the two Americans who had beaten Davis were not US officials but standover men, in league with some corrupt Vietnamese police, running an extortion racket over currency dealers. Economic necessity made dealing on the black market normal practice. ABC correspondent Jim Revitt cannot recall why Davis let Dima, the Indian money changer, operate in the Viz News office. It was certainly convenient for the visiting correspondents who needed his services, but in a city that lived on its nerves, Dima lived on the edge of nervous collapse. Dima certainly faced the confiscation of his funds and a prison term if he were caught in his currency deals, a fate that Davis often predicted with devilish glee. He would sometimes make a huge commotion, coming back to the office, shouting in Vietnamese and kicking the door before bursting in on the petrified Indian. Revitt said Dima never had the personality for money changing. Every deal with visiting journalists used to send him white with fear. One day, Jim Revitt recalls, Davis came back from a field assignment. Every deal with visiting journalists used to send him white with fear. One day, Jim Revitt recalls, Davis came back from a field assignment with an excellent captured Viet Cong flag, a highly marketable item among American officers. The sight of the flag sent Dima into a frenzy of fear. His state of mind was not improved when Davis announced his intention not of selling the flag, but of displaying it on the office wall. "Oh no, that is not a very good idea, Mr. Neal," stuttered Dima, visibly paling. "More better you sell it to some American colonel." Davis thought for a minute and said, "Well, if we've got to sell it, we've got to advertise. I'm going to hang it out the window." Revitt was relatively unconcerned, knowing Davis's habit of teasing Dima. Outside in the street were dozens of armed troops and police and dozens of notoriously trigger-happy guards in front of the building directly across the street. There was no way, he thought, that Davis would actually do it. Davis attached the Viet Cong flag to the windowsill with sticky tape and flung it out. Revitt was stunned, but only momentarily. He collided with the terrified money changer as they dived forward to pull the flag in, while Davis collapsed on the floor, helpless with laughter. "Got you, Revitt," he said. "I figured you'd be just as scared as Deemer when the crunch came." There we go on the upload limit. Back with the new movie. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Ciao. Arr.